If it's Wednesday, the pace of inflation hits a new 40-year high with less than 4 months until the midterms. What's driving the jump in prices and what it means for the economy, the White House, and you in just a moment. Plus, devastating security footage, 77 minutes of excruciating detail, new video showing what police were and were not doing as the Robb Elementary gunman shot and killed 19 children. The latest on that story ahead. And later, the State Department calls out Russia's use of so-called filtration camps in Ukraine. Details on the war crimes reportedly taking place and the U.S.'s response ahead. And welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. As President Biden kicks off his trip through the Middle East, his administration is facing a growing problem at home, with prices rising at their highest pace in 40 years and Americans paying more for items across the board for where they live, for what they eat, and how they travel. This morning, the Labor Department reported the prices last month climbed 9.1% compared to a year ago, higher than expected. That includes gas prices up more than 59%, although prices are currently down from a month ago. The price for new cars up more than 11%. The price for food up 10%, and housing costs up more than 5.5%. Today's report comes less than a week after the administration received some good economic news, with June's jobs report showing more than 370,000 new jobs were created last month. It poses a tremendous challenge for policymakers and the White House as the Federal Reserve prepares to raise interest rates yet again to try to cool demand. But at these levels, there are growing concerns that the only way to tame 9% inflation might be to tip the U.S. into a recession. In a statement, President Biden called today's report, quote, out of date, citing falling gas prices. He also called inflation his top priority, while calling on oil and gas companies in Congress to take action to ensure prices continue to drop. Now, the president's top economic advisor echoed those demands.
If there's one thing to take away from this report, it's that there is more urgency now than ever in Congress moving to pass a bill to try to build more domestic semiconductors, to try to bring down the price of those goods. You see across this report things like used cars and new vehicles, those prices holding up. That is not principally driven by demand. It's driven by supply and constrained supply. We know how to solve that. We should have solved that months ago, but we now have a moment. We need to do that. If there's any takeaway from this report, it should be that.
Today's report comes nearly a year to the day after President Biden dismissed concerns about inflation. 1 year later, inflation is now the biggest crisis facing this White House. In the Middle East, how concerned are they about this report? And are there concerns that the president's message isn't strong enough on this matter?
Yeah, Kristen, they're so concerned that they were issuing prebuttals to this report, and their prebuttal was what they wound up saying after it came out, which is that this data is stale and it doesn't reflect the current dynamics. The problem that the president and the White House have with that, to Steph's point, is that you can't pick and choose which data or which report you like and then you don't like. It's all the same. It's all always a month old, and so that saying something like that just isn't necessarily going to resonate with people who are saying, look, I'm seeing prices increase everywhere. I don't care what the numbers say. And that's the problem that the president has with his messaging here, and that he's been complaining about to his advisors when it comes to his messaging, yet he's still doing it, which is it's not connecting with people and their experience and how they're experiencing inflation. It's not a number to them, that data, old data, new data. They don't care. They just know that costs are high. And so this is the top concern for this White House. They are struggling how to deal with it. They have been for some time. And if you look at the president's statement today, when he said what he was willing to do to try to bring down inflation, it's the same things he's been saying for months. It's lower gas prices. It's turned to Congress to try to get some legislation passed. That's just something that doesn't look like it's going to happen in any really big, meaningful way that's going to impact people's lives. And then he points to the Fed, also something that is out of control. So they still haven't really found their footing here on how to deal with, and we're just several months now from those midterm elections, Kristen.
And that brings us to why he is in the Middle East, why you are there reporting on his trip. Carol, part of his goal, based on our reporting, is to try to press Saudi leaders to produce more oil. But you and I have been talking about the fact that there's not a whole lot of confidence that there will be significant deliverables from this trip. Carol, how did these new numbers impact, if at all, these meetings and the president's broader approach here in Saudi Arabia?
No, thanks for asking.
If anything, Kristen, it just adds more pressure to what the president has to have coming out of this. And what we've seen from the White House is, look, the conversation that he's having with the Saudis is just going to be different than what recent presidents have had with Saudi leaders because of that price of gas, also because relationships have been very strained. But what the president is trying to do here is get them to produce. They're saying they have more capacity, the oil producing Gulf states, to produce more oil. They want them to do that. And yet they also don't want them to go to full capacity because there are concerns about that. So he's trying to get them to come, he's trying to come away from this trip with some sort of statement that he can say that he's gotten something for this when it comes to oil, even though they want to downplay, the White House does, that aspect of this visit. That really is the key component. The one thing they keep continuing to do, Kristen, the administration officials, when you talk to them, is play down the idea that the president's going to leave, and even if Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states do everything that he wants them to do when it comes to oil production, that's going to have some immediate impact. They're just saying this is not something that's going to be immediately felt by people. Even if he does get a victory here, this is going to take potentially months to be felt. And so it's tricky for him, and it's there's a lot of stake in what he's going to be able to come away with. And at the same time, as with other things that the president says he wants to do to bring down gas prices and inflation, it's not necessarily something people are going to feel right away.
I think that context is so important, Carol, and the broader point that you make that this is only intensifying the pressure on President Biden to try to come home with something after this very fraught trip. Thank you for setting the stakes for us, Stephanie and Carol. Really appreciate your great reporting. With me now is White House Economic Advisor Heather Boushey. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate it, Heather. So let me just allow you to respond to the numbers that we saw today and the pain, frankly, that people are feeling every day when they go to the grocery store, when they go to the gas pump. What do you say to Americans who are making ends meet when they see a number like this and they just start to lose hope?
Well, the president today was abundantly clear that today's inflation data is unacceptably high. And we know that this is due to the fact that nearly half of the monthly increase in inflation is due to energy prices. And so we know why we are here. We're recovering from a historic pandemic. We've had these ongoing supply chain issues with businesses that have not been able to, smoothly recover from the pandemic. And then on top of that, we have this unprovoked war in the Ukraine that Putin has been waging that has upended global energy markets. And that has led to a lot of pain at the pump for American families. And that's a big piece of this puzzle here today. And, one of the things that you've mentioned here is that, we have seen gas prices start to fall a little bit. One of the things that about energy markets is that when oil prices start spiking, gas prices at the pump also spike really quickly. But often on the way down, there's a pretty big gap. So even though the price of oil has come down markedly, we haven't seen gas come down as much, but there has been some good news in recent weeks. Over the past 30 days, we've seen the price at the pump fall. I think that is a really important trend, given the longstanding, well-known disparity between how fast oil prices fall and how fast gas prices fall.
And Heather, let me follow up with you on that point. Are you trying to make the case that prices have peaked? And if so, how can you be sure?
I am not making the case that I know that prices have peaked. What I'm saying, though, is that we have seen oil prices, the price for the global market price for a barrel of oil, it did peak around 120 and it's come down since then. It's closer to $100 a barrel now. And we want to see those decreases in prices appear at the gas pumps for Americans. And so that is one of the things that you don't see fully in the CPI data that was released today, because it's happening happening right now.
Okay, let me follow up with you on the messaging, the broader messaging, because you're echoing essentially what we heard from President Biden in his message today, which is that these numbers are out of date. And look, he touted the fact that, as he said, quote, these numbers, this data does not reflect the full impact of nearly 30 days of decreases in gas prices. Gas, though, Heather, is still painfully high. It's $4.63 a gallon. So I guess the question is that the right messaging for this moment? Do you not run the risk of sounding out of touch with the pain that so many people are feeling?
I mean, here's the thing. We, the United States, and of course, countries around the world, are recovering from this global pandemic, dealing with all of the challenges of getting our economies back up and running. We've seen how hard this has been for American businesses to re-put together their fragile supply chains. And then on top of this war has really created this energy crunch. Mm-hmm. And so what the president has made clear time and time again is that he completely understands how challenging this is for families. And he's doing everything he can to get the economy back on track. He's done so much to shore up America's supply chains, try to fix what's broken there. And he's done a lot what he can do to lower prices at the pump. But here's the thing. When you buy oil on a global market, you don't control the price. Mm-hmm. And so the strongest, the most important thing we can do is, the kind of legislation that's sitting in front of Congress right now, where they are debating whether or not to put us on a path to a saner energy future, where prices can be more stable, they can be lower. And yes, certainly that is not necessarily going to affect prices at the pump tomorrow, but it certainly will have an effect. And,
Heather, let me just really quickly, because to that point, Senator Manchin today was pressed on his reaction to these numbers. And one of the things that they're debating, obviously, is this reconciliation package. And based on what we heard from Senator Manchin today, it seems like he's a lot less likely to get on board. I want to play you what he said and get your reaction on the other side.
Do these inflation numbers make you more inclined or less inclined to move forward with this reconciliation package? I'm asking you. What do you? I mean,
right now we should all be extremely cautious. People are hurting. People are hurting. I mean, just the cost of every good, and especially the staples of life, whether it be milk and whether it be eggs, whether it be, the prices of inflation, and also the energy that's taken right now in order to live a daily life.
Do these numbers doom any new spending, any new legislation that involves new spending, and should they?
It should do, quite frankly, the opposite. Nothing could be more important right now than Congress putting its nose to the grindstone.
But how do you get it done when Senator Manchin is saying it's a no-go, essentially?
You need to make the case to him, explain to him, and explain to the American people that what that legislation would do is lower the cost of things that are important to families. Let's lower the cost of prescription drugs. That is something we can do right now. And then that money that you're not spending on prescription drugs frees up families to spend on things. Lower the cost of healthcare. And yes, let's lower the cost of energy by making these investments that are going to put us on that path so that we aren't here again. We've been here before, and we will continue to be subject to the vagaries of geopolitical considerations when it comes to energy markets until we fix what ails us. And that is what the president wants to do. So it's dealing both with the here and now, dealing with prices today, and laying the foundation for stronger changes in the future.
We know that because we are running out of time, and I just want to get to one or two more questions. We know that one of the things that the president is considering doing, he's called for a gas tax holiday. He's also considering lifting tariffs on China. And it's believed that a decision could be coming this month. Is it your expectation that the president's going to make a final decision this month, and that if he does decide to do so, it would be moderate?
Well, the president has been very clear that addressing inflation is his number one priority. Again, that's why he has been so focused on getting this reconciliation and the Bipartisan Innovation Act across the table. And he has been willing to pull out all the stops, everything from releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to calling on refiners to, yes, lowering a federal gas tax and putting a federal gas tax holiday and encouraging states to do the same.
Do you expect a decision this month, though, Heather?
I expect that the president is focused on doing everything he can to reduce inflation. So I'm certain. So this is a top priority for him.
Okay. All right. Heather Boushey, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. All right. Coming up, what went wrong in Uvalde? New surveillance video takes us inside the halls of Robb Elementary. for 77 excruciating minutes. Why one Texas public safety official is calling the police response a, quote, abject failure, and the community's response next. Plus, all eyes on Capitol Hill fallout over yesterday's explosive testimony and allegations of potential witness tampering as the January 6th committee plans its 8th hearing. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Families affected by recent mass shootings in Highland Park and Uvalde rallied today in Washington to call for an assault weapons ban. The gathering comes after some gut-wrenching video. It was posted yesterday afternoon ahead of its anticipated public release this weekend, showing the attack and the police response inside Robb Elementary School. The footage raises additional uncomfortable questions about how law enforcement reacted to the horrific mass shooting that killed 19 students and 2 teachers in May. We want to warn viewers, the footage they are about to see is incredibly disturbing. It's from video that was obtained and initially edited by the Austin American Statesman and local television station KVUE. It pieces together security video from outside and inside the school, as well as police body camera video, cell phone video, and 911 audio. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock has more on what the footage shows.
The gunman walks across the parking lot and into the school at 11:33, casually carrying a rifle, and turning a corner in the hallway, a young student comes around the corner as the shooter walks down the hall. Seconds later, gunfire erupts, lasting for more than 2 minutes. The young child runs away. 3 minutes later, the first officers enter the school. As the gunfire continues, some officers approach the classrooms, while others hold back. More shots, and they retreat. 19 minutes after the gunman entered, heavily armed reinforcements arrive with ballistic shields, holding up their weapons but standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for nearly half an hour. Eventually, a unit moves in a stack formation toward the classroom door, others again holding back. 48 minutes after the gunman entered, more rounds and inaudible conversation. One officer seen getting hand sanitizer while the gunman is still a threat in the classroom. After 77 minutes, a volley of gunfire when Border Patrol officers finally breached the classroom.
So tough to watch that. Officials have expressed their frustration with how the video was posted. Texas DPS Director Steve McGraw, who has called the shooting response an abject failure, said the families should have been the first to view it. Uvalde's mayor also expressed anger on the family's behalf. Joining me now to discuss the very latest on the ground in Uvalde is NBC News correspondent Antonia Hylton. Also with us is retired ATF Special Agent in Charge and an NBC News contributor, Jim Cavanaugh. Thanks to both of you for being here. Antonia, I want to start with you. I know you've been talking to families of the victims, the folks there in Uvalde, some of whom were in D.C. today, grappling with yet another reminder of a failed police response and just trying to deal with the fact that this video was released before some of them had a chance to view the footage. What are community members there telling you? What's the reaction been on the ground?
Well, Kristen, there's a lot of conflicting emotions here because it's been 7 weeks since a gunman killed 19 children and 2 beloved teachers. And so many of these parents, these family members, have been calling for transparency. They wanted to see this surveillance video. But, you know, they were expecting to see it at a Sunday morning meeting. And so the release last night came as a shock, a very painful shock to many. They were calling family members and friends saying, don't go on Twitter, don't turn on your TV. This is up there and out there. It's hard to watch. Others were at a city council meeting last night shouting at the mayor, who had called the reporters who released this surveillance video chickens and unprofessional, but they were shooting back saying, you know, do you think the cops are chickens? And so there was so much anger here. Some of it directed at the reporters who released this early, but a lot of it directed at the law enforcement. Because as you just described, and our colleague Sam Brock just described, you know, you're watching these officers wait. At one point, many people have mentioned the hand sanitizer moment. Just seeing an officer wash his hands, they almost see that as like a metaphor for the law enforcement here washing their hands of their responsibility in this incident. Take a listen to what many of the community members have shared with us here.
I think it was very disrespectful to the families, first of all. And it confirmed to me personally, it confirmed to me that these police officers, every single one of them, cowards.
Watching that video, waiting to see whether or not what they were going to release, because we didn't know exactly what they were going to release, made us relive May 24th all over again. We already knew that they did nothing. That just confirmed our anger. That just confirmed that we had a reason to be angry.
I don't know why they just didn't go in there. I just don't know why. They were so innocent. I don't know why. How can they do that? I'm just so mad at them.
It's so hard to listen to the pain in that mother's voice. NBC News has reached out to law enforcement for comment on all of this, but consistently over the last several weeks, they've defended themselves, including Chief Arredondo, who's been at the center of controversy, saying that he fought to get keys to get into the classroom. You know, officials had said that police had really put themselves in the line of fire. When you look at this video, Kristen, it's really hard to make sense of what ultimately happened that day.
It absolutely is. And I think you said it so well, Antonia. When you see that officer reach for hand sanitizer, it's enraging. And it is a metaphor, I think, for the response that day. Really well put. I want to turn to you on that. Jim, what do you see when you watch this footage and this great point that Antonia makes, which is that that moment in many ways just encapsulates the dereliction of duty?
Right, Christian. It's not what the public wants to see or any of us want to see. First thing I noticed is just how easily the gunman walks in. So we start with a failure of 2 locked doors. If just one of those doors had been locked and the first responding officers get there in 2-3 minutes, maybe they could have trapped them in the hallway. But it's an epic failure of police response to an active shooter training. So just to break it down quickly, the first 3 officers were trained in that. We were all trained in that post-Columbine. You know, you grab the first 1, 2, 3 officers, you make a triangle stack, you go right to the shooter, killer, you engage him, try to take him out. That's the training. The first 3 officers do that. They go right to the classroom door, but they don't enter. They should have entered and engaged him and killed him. And the first officer at the door has a handgun, and the 2 other officers in the hallway have police tactical rifles. They should be leading going in the door, and the officer with the handgun behind them maybe opening the door for them, which we now know, of course, the door was not locked. They lied about that in the beginning and said it was locked. It was not locked, so they should have went in. But even if they were shot, wounded slightly when they went to the door, then other officers who had already arrived and are in the video, another 3 at least, should have taken up the charge to go in and kill the gunman. So all these officers arriving, 30 minutes later, 40 minutes later, to me, Kristen, that's a moot point. This guy should have been dead early on from those first 3 or the second 3 officers that would engage him right away. They had rifles and the door was unlocked. So it's an epic, an epic failure. And the only thing you can attribute it to is a lack of leadership and a lack of courage. They had some initial bravery, the first 3, when they went up there and they got wounded. And even if they retreated, the other 3 should have taken up the fight, or they could have stayed and taken up the fight. But there's no way to put a nice spin on it.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. I mean, is this a failure of leadership and or communication, or both, do you think?
Well, I'll tell you, I think that the police review down there is relying a lot on communication. I think we should all throw that away. The active shooter training is the first 3 officers going in the stack. They were there. When they get repelled by the gunfire, there's 3 more right there. You don't need any communication for that. Who are you going to call? City Hall, the chief, the head of the state police? A brain in a jar somewhere. You have everybody you need right there to do the action you're trained to do. There's nobody else to call. Walkie-talkies and all that is just, that doesn't matter. You need to go in right there. So that's a red herring communication here. The officers that needed to take care of the killer were right there on the scene with their rifles.
Jim, very quickly, what should the consequences be for those officers? And does there need to be an update at all to the protocol?
I do think there does need to be more training. There does need to be more training going into active gunfire. It's just, simulated, but active gunfire. Just like firefighters have to run into burning buildings. If you don't want to do that, you need to be in another profession. And also we have to train harder on our patrol officers, who are the first ones in there, to go in quickly. And we've seen it across the country in many mass killings where officers are shot and wounded and killed. So we can also cite many cases where there's been extreme bravery. But we have a few, Parkland in Florida, and this one, where we see, a lack of bravery and courage, and it results in tragedy. Every officer has to have on the front of their mind, it's not a revelation that wounded people, in this case children, are going to bleed to death if you don't get in there quickly and stop the killing. That's not something you shouldn't not be, right on the tip of your mind. Every officer should know that. So there's no waiting for command from anybody. You should know on an active killing. People are bleeding in there. They need help. I'm here. I have training. I have rifles.
Yep.
There's more of us than him. Let's go kill him. And that's what they needed to do.
Powerful last point. Jim Cavanaugh, thank you so much. And Antonia Hylton, thank you for your incredible reporting from the ground. Up next, a hot-blooded Oval Office meeting, an unhinged West Wing, and allegations of witness tampering. We head to Capitol Hill after the break for the latest on the January 6 hearings. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As President Biden begins his Middle East trip, the same domestic issues on inflation, gun violence, and abortion access continue for Democrats. And as we just heard from Capitol Hill, former President Trump continues to insert himself into the January 6th hearing and on the campaign trail. Joining me now to discuss all of this, today's great panel, I'm joined by Washington Post live anchor and early 202 co-author Leigh Ann Caldwell, Democratic pollster Margie Omero, and Republican strategist Brad Todd. Thanks to all of you for being here. Let's start with the big news of the day, which is inflation. And we got this statement from President Biden essentially saying, look, these numbers are not reflective of the snapshot and the reality right now. And gas prices are starting to come down. Margie, what do you make of that messaging? And does he risk looking out of touch?
I think when you have messaging that you demonstrate that you understand what people are going through, that's important. People are really feeling inflation without following what the latest reports are. People can tell you very clearly what the impact is on their daily life. We did some focus groups for AARP not that long ago, and people said, I wanted to Zoom with my granddaughter, but I had to turn off the Zoom because I had to work because I needed 1 extra hour. And she was in tears thinking about what inflation meant to just that little bit of extra family time that she wanted to have. At the same time, I am hearing a little bit about people feeling that maybe gas prices are going down. I think that's something to continue to look at. But it's important to really acknowledge that people may be feeling a variety of conflicting things, seeing job opportunities, but also feeling like the job opportunities they have may not be able to pay the things that they're used to paying for.
Yeah, and Leigh Ann, when you talk to Democrats, there has been so much frustration around the messaging that's coming out of the White House. On the one hand, you hear sometimes it's not robust enough and focused enough on the bright spots, but then you get a statement like the one today, where on the one hand you have soaring inflation, a new high yet again, and the president basically trying to say, look, this is an old snapshot. Do Democrats feel like he's starting to get it right in terms of messaging, or is there still a lot of frustration?
There's been a lot of frustration among Democrats with the Biden administration on messaging on a whole host of issues. But sticking to inflation, what I heard from Democrats today on Capitol Hill is Sean Patrick Maloney, for example, who's trying to elect Democrats to the House of Representatives as chair of the DCCC. He said flat out, inflation is a problem, and it's a problem, he said, but they have a new message, and that is that it's not just U.S. inflation, it's global inflation. And so they're saying, Biden didn't cause the inflation in England. He didn't cause the inflation overseas as well. So that's the latest messaging from House Democrats.
But our inflation is 9.1%. In Europe, it's 6%. So ours is 50% higher than it's been in 40 years in the United States. And it started because the president deliberately drove up the price of oil and gas and drove down domestic production. That's 45% of our inflation is because of transportation cost increase. This was intentional. And the president then says it's transitory, it's not as bad as you think. But this was a deliberate attempt to drive up the price of energy, knowing it'd drive up inflation.
People, when I talk to voters, they either in polls or focus groups, they see all of the above, multiple choice, and they say yes, this. There are a variety of causes to inflation, and people tend to recognize that. They think there are corporations that are raising prices, taking advantage of a moment, boasting about their earnings. There is reopening that is leading to increased demand. There's a variety of different things at play.
But there's some duplicitous in that as the Democrats. You know, the Biden loves to attack people who own gas stations, but 80% of the gas stations in America are mom and pops. They make 2 or 3 cents a gallon on gas, and the president of the United States comes out and attacks them and accuses them.
It's really the big oil producers, though, and they're also saying back off.
Stations, though, he attacks the people who own gas stations, and most of those people are making most of their money on soda pop and cigarettes.
Well, I wonder if, from a legislative perspective, this really dooms the prospects of getting anything passed. You have Joe Manchin out today essentially saying now is not the time for new spending. It seemed like there had been some type of progress behind the scenes, and Leigh Ann, you can do the fact check on this, on the reconciliation bill, which would have brought down the price of things like prescription drugs, among other things that they're working on. Does this doom any new legislation?
When we started the week, there was more optimism than I have seen in a long time among Senate Democrats, especially Senate leadership, on this reconciliation bill, this slimmed down Build Back Better plan. But just 2 days later, these new inflation numbers, remember Joe Manchin single-handedly killed the larger Build Back Better plan, in part, not completely, but in part because of concerns of inflation. And so Joe Manchin's statements today is causing a lot of alarm bells on Capitol Hill, and we don't know where the status of those negotiations are now. Especially Schumer has COVID, not in town. He's still part of these negotiations, but it's really tenuous.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's not a good time to be them, because when you raise taxes and raise spending, voters understand that's not good for the economy, but yet they're already wedded to it because of a year of negotiations. So I don't envy Chuck Schumer to try to keep his caucus happy and worry about getting people reelected.
Margie, let me let you respond, and then I want to move on to another point.
People have supported Build Back Better, from the beginning. It's been tested a million ways from Sunday in every kind of public polling, whether it includes pay-fors, whether it doesn't include pay-fors, longer versions, shorter versions, however you ask it, with messaging, without messaging. It's popular. It's not true to say people know that it's going to hurt the economy. People say this is going to help me in all kinds of different ways.
Does it hurt Democrats, do you think, if they can't get some progress on Build Back Better, understanding they're not going to get the whole thing passed, but if they can't get a few pieces passed before the midterms?
I think people want to see Washington get something done. I think that's what voters feel, that Washington is not getting things done. But they also want to see contrasts and see, point to, want to figure out who's behind the obstruction. And that's also pretty evident and can really draw a real contrast between who is trying to score political points, is what a phrase that a lot of people use, versus trying to, see the urgency and trying to help people.
And what's looming over all of this, of course, is former President Trump. And we know that he's been having discussions about when he might announce his reelection. Brad, I've been talking to a number of Republicans who are nervous that he's going to announce this summer. They say if he does, it's going to take all the focus off of inflation, all of the focus off of what they want to be on President Biden and his record. How much of a risk do you think it is for Republicans in the midterms if the former president announces this summer?
Well, I think a lot of Republicans, of course, wish they had the Trump economy instead of the Biden economy. But I don't think the president has the ability to commandeer the entire political stage. We only have elections about the current president. We've never had an election that revolved around a previan president.
But he would soak up a lot of oxygen, would he?
I don't think with inflation at 9%, you can take the attention in this election off this president.
Margie?
I mean, look, the polls show that Biden would lead Trump in a reelect, in a rematch, and voters feel kind of sick of Trump and his antics. Even Republicans, you see Republicans when you say, "What do you think of Trump?" and focus groups are like, "It's time for him to, it's enough. I've had it with him." And the fact that he's making his main contribution as a former president, really talking about January 6th, contrast that with what we've seen from previous former presidents in their retirement, what they do. It's just a real sign that he's in this for himself.
Leigh Ann, of course, the action has been on Capitol Hill. These hearings, the January 6th committee hearings, we had another one yesterday. And if you look at the polling, it does seem to be chipping away at the support of former President Trump around the edges to some extent, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be helping Democrats. So far, what do you think the impact of these hearings has been?
I think that it's still to be determined. I don't think we know yet. I think that Democrats that I talk to on Capitol Hill do not think that that's the issue that is going to win the election for them. There's no illusion under that. They know it's going to be inflation. They know it's going to be the economy. They hope abortion helps them out, the abortion decision. But as far as the hearings are concerned, they say that their goal for this is not to win the election, but they are the stewards of democracy, and they have to do it regardless of what the political impacts are. Although some do say, especially the members in the more progressive districts, they say that their voters are absolutely tuning in.
We know that DOJ is watching as well, Brad. Yesterday, Vice Chair Liz Cheney said that the former president had contacted one of the witnesses. We don't know the specifics. We don't know the extent of the potential legal jeopardy. But does that type of a revelation, do you think, increase the chances that this could be taken up by the Department of Justice?
I don't think it's any news that DOJ's been watching everything all along. We've all known that. And I think that should DOJ choose to do something, then the country would pay attention. But I don't think most of the country is paying attention to these hearings.
Last word.
So Navigator Research, as regular poll that we do, showed continued support for the investigation, an increase in support, particularly with independents. Lots of things that Trump has done are concerning, even with a pretty large number of Republicans. And I know this is not reflective but representative, but at the Tacoma, I'm in Jamie Raskin's district, at the 4th of July parade, when he walks down the street, everybody acts as if like the Beatles have come through town. So at least in Tacoma Park and Jamie Raskin's home district, it is going down very well.
All right, good anecdotal evidence there. All right, great conversation. Thank you, Margie, Brad, and Leigh Ann. Really appreciate it. And still ahead, President Biden oversees amid new reports of Russian filtration camps being used to, quote, detain or disappear thousands of Ukrainian civilians. I'm going to talk to a former White House Deputy National Security Advisor. That's after a very quick break. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. Welcome back. The State Department is estimating the Russian government has forcibly deported up to 1.6 million Ukrainians, including 260,000 children from their homes to Russia. In a statement, Secretary Blinken said Russia's, quote, filtration operations are separating families and confiscating Ukrainian passports in place of Russian passports in attempts to change the demographics within Ukraine. The State Department also said Russian authorities are, quote, disappearing some Ukrainians, particularly those associated with Ukraine's government, media, or civil society groups. Eyewitnesses and survivors have reported some individuals targeted have been executed. The State Department is calling these operations war crimes and a breach of the Geneva Conventions. The news from the State Department comes as President Biden arrived in Israel today to kick off a 4-day trip to the Middle East region. He was briefed today on the country's Iron Dome system and when laid a wreath at Israel's Holocaust Memorial. But all eyes will be on the president's meetings later this week in Saudi Arabia, especially as new inflation numbers show energy prices up 41.6% over the last year. I'm joined now by someone who knows what it's like to be a part of a presidential trip overseas. I was with him on a number of these trips overseas. Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security to former President Obama and an NBC News political contributor. Ben, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Good to see you, Kristen.
I want to start with this just incredibly disturbing news from the State Department about Russia's filtration operations. In addition to just condemning them and calling them war crimes, what do you think the Biden administration can actually do, and how can they hold Russia accountable?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely horrifying. It recalls really the Stalin-era tactics that Russia used back then to move whole populations and ethnic populations around in order to control territory. And what you may see here from Russia is not just moving these people out, but seeking to repopulate areas of eastern Ukraine that they have conquered with Russians to solidify that territory as part of Russia. In terms of what can be done, I think, first of all, spotlighting it like this is going to be part of a global diplomatic strategy to appeal to those kind of fence-sitting countries around the world outside of Europe who've yet to really take a stand against Russia's invasion, to put pressure on them to join the coalition of countries that are sanctioning Russia, that are enforcing sanctions. And then you want to send a message to Russian officials. Look, Vladimir Putin clearly doesn't care, but that there will be war crimes investigations into this. And if you're a part of this filtration effort, whether it's 1 year from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, you're going to be held accountable. You want to get inside the heads of those people.
Let's turn to the president's trip specifically. He is in Israel, as we were just reporting. What are your expectations of his visit to Israel? I know that the expectations, broadly speaking, have been quite low, given Israel's going to be holding elections again in November. How does the president try to get something done, given the fraught political backdrop?
Well, you're right. You have essentially a caretaker prime minister there in Yair Lapid, who's only been there for a few weeks, an upcoming election. So this is not something where you can make dramatic new steps. I think you're not going to see anything on some of the issues that, we were dealing with, Kristen, when you were on those trips, like the Middle East peace process. That feels kind of moribund in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think what you will see is an embrace, really, of this bloc that is formed between Israel and the Gulf Arab states, which is really about Iran. And so I think what you're seeing is a more sharp-edged Biden administration approach to Iran. President Biden making comments today that suggest that the Iran nuclear agreement is unlikely to be reentered so long as there's this impediment of a sanction that he doesn't want to remove on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And he'll want to tout, I'm sure, the normalization process between the Gulf states and Israel. And the reality is a big motivating force for that normalization pact is the shared views that those countries have on Iran. So to me, it feels like this trip, in addition to the awkwardness that's upcoming with Mohammed bin Salman, speaks to a turn towards a potentially more escalatory situation with Iran.
Well, let me ask you about some comments that President Biden made on Iran, Ben, that are making some waves. He was asked during an interview with Israel's Channel 12 about the situation in Iran. He didn't rule out using force as a last resort to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. What did you make of that response?
Well, I think the idea that the United States would consider the use of military force to prevent Iran from getting a weapon is not new. The rhetoric, the language is a bit more pointed. I think coupling that, however, with the kind of moribund Iran deal reentry talks and this line that Biden has drawn around an issue that, by all reports, is important to getting back into the deal. If you take that together with this multi-day embrace, really, of Israel and the Gulf states' views on Iran, I think you're in a potentially dangerous situation, because the reality, Kristen, is that since leaving the Iran nuclear deal, we've seen Iran dramatically increase its nuclear program, its nuclear stockpile, the kinds of machinery that they're using on the nuclear program, and really reaching the precipice of having enough nuclear material for a weapon. So this is not something that has gotten a lot of attention with the war in Ukraine and inflation, but we could be entering a chapter here where the United States finds itself kind of drifting away from the kind of diplomacy and diplomatic effort to solve the Iranian nuclear program towards a more confrontational position. Yeah. And we've seen in the past under Trump how that can kind of put us, on the precipice of potential military escalation.
And very quickly, we have less than a minute left, Ben. What are your expectations of his meeting with Saudi leaders? We know that is very fraught as well. Ultimately, the U.S. would like Saudi Arabia to release and produce more oil. What are your expectations there?
I mean, it makes me very uncomfortable. I think for Mohammed bin Salman, it's very clear what he gets. He kind of gets to launder his reputation and kind of be welcomed back into the good graces of the international community with a presidential visit. They'll also be discussing, I think, defense cooperation. And again, that ties back into Iran. That's something the Saudis very much want. In terms of increased oil capacity, there's not all that much that the Saudis and the Emiratis can do to bring down gas prices. Every little bit helps, but my expectations aren't that particularly high.
Ben Rhodes,
the rhetoric
we are
will be
out
good,
of
but I'm
time.
not sure that the follow-through will be.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.